Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Dr. Anne Higonnet about her book titled Liberty, Equality, Fashion: The Women Who Styled the French Revolution, published in 2024 by Norton, which takes us to the French Revolution and tells a story that in some sense has been literally in front of our eyes, but hasn't been properly told, which is that amongst all the other things that happened with the French Revolution, there was also a massive, massive change in women's clothing. And as this book demonstrates, as I'm sure our conversation will uncover, that's not by accident. That has to do with some key women doing some really interesting things, and creates a huge difference in what women are wearing and what clothing means and all sorts of other things that I'm sure we'll get into. So, Anne, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
It's delightful to be here and speaking to you and your audience.
Well, I'm delighted to have you, and I think a good place to start would be if you could introduce yourself a little bit and explain why you decided to write this book.
Well, I'm a rogue art historian. I was checking footnotes for an art historical essay in the Morgan Library and Museum in New York and discovered a treasure trove of fashion plates, which are among the rarest in the world. And they annihilated a legend about scandalous, obscene clothing in the French Revolution. And I thought I should take a hint from these fashion plates and correct that false legend.
What a great origin story, and love the shout out to the Morgan Library. Can you tell us a bit more about kind of what that myth was and what you found that gave you that idea it wasn't very true?
The standard story about the clothing revolution for women in the French Revolution is that it was sexually extravagant and licentious and exposed women to such an extent that they died of pneumonia during the winter because they were hardly wearing any dresses at all and would wet the dresses to make them cling even further.
And what did you discover in the Morgan Library that suggested that was maybe more myth than reality?
Well, the fashion plates were very, very well known to researchers. They were a standard archive to study for the period, but it was an archive which, due to the vagaries of the revolution, had been scattered. So scholars had just been looking at a fashion plate here, a fashion plate there. And they did that according to the assumptions of the legend that they had learned. Whereas in the Morgan, I was looking at the fashion plates week by week, and I discovered that these dresses were not transparent at all, but that they did give women a physical freedom that women had never had before in the history of Western Europe. And that's the story I wanted to tell.
All right, let's get into that story then. The book centers around kind of three key women, but I think helpfully for readers and helpfully for our conversation, they don't all kind of enter the scene at the same time. So we can take them sort of one by one for a while and then see what they do together. So starting with the girl who would become Empress Joséphine, the kind of noted fashion icon. Obviously, she didn't start off that way. So can you tell us a bit about the world she was coming from when she first came to Paris? And what was the Parisian fashion that she was being introduced to at that point?
Joséphine was a member of a very marginally noble family that was trying to make money on the colonized island of Martinique by having a sugar plantation, a notoriously brutal kind of agriculture that depended on enslaved labor. To control that labor, the French government had issued a code noir, a black code, in 1685 to control every aspect of the lives of the enslaved. As time went on, some of those enslaved people earned their freedom, and many of them began to want to dress in a more dignified way than they had been allowed by that 1685 Code Noir. So they began to use the only materials allowed to them by law, cotton, and invent radically new styles of clothing. So much so that the French government issued another edict in 1720 to try to control this fashion innovation. And then, because it kept on happening, yet another edict in 1754. So Joséphine grew up on an island in which enslaved women of color and freed women of color were inventing a new kind of cotton fashion and accessory ecology.
This is a very interesting kind of formative aspect. But before we go into the other thing I asked you about, I really want to pick up on this idea of kind of what they were allowed to before we get to Paris. Sumptuary laws are not just something that happen in this particular time period or place, right? Rules about what people can or cannot wear. But these ones are in some ways pretty extreme. So can you tell us a bit more when we say people aren't or are allowed to wear certain things? What exactly are some of these rules, and what are the enforcements and penalties for breaking them?
Well, Miranda, your use of the word extreme is perfect, because sumptuary laws, which began to come about sort of 1200, 1300 in all the monarchies of Europe, were designed to allow a monarchic hierarchy to show where it belonged on the hierarchy according to the value of the materials they wore. And a key to sumptuary laws was to restrict in a very extreme way the wearing of materials to one person, the king, at the very top of the hierarchy. The king was allowed to wear ermine, the king was allowed to wear purple, the king was allowed any kind of quantity of gold or silver embroidery, and so forth and so on. And then on down the ranks, sumptuary laws explained exactly what materials and what extent of materials could be used by the different ranks. And it went all the way down to the poor, who were well over 99% of the European population, who basically wore rags. The penalties were social censure. They were sometimes fines. They were sometimes prison sentences. So there were real consequences for breaking sumptuary laws. Then, when France began to have colonies with enslaved labor, they extended those sumptuary laws down to a new extreme, past the rags allocated to European peasants, and down to the new extreme of what was allowed to the enslaved.
Yeah, I'm glad we stayed on this for a moment, because it's not all sumptuary laws are created the same, right? This one is worth kind of staying on for a second to go, wait a second, they're taking clothes, even just fabric before it becomes clothes, incredibly seriously in this culture. So can you tell us kind of what the other end of the spectrum looks like? You know, Joséphine goes from this tropical island where women are innovating within these strictures and doing really, I mean, the book has some gorgeous images of what this would have looked like, to the heart of all of this, with these strict laws being implemented in a kind of on the other end of the social scale. So what did that kind of clothing look like? What was Joséphine being told to wear? What did it kind of, take us into that dress shop?
Well, she arrives in Paris because she's been sent to an arranged marriage on the mainland of France because her very marginally aristocratic family on Martinique is trying to claw its way up the social scale. And when she arrives, not surprisingly, her new family looks at her and says, "Ooh, you need a makeover because we need you to be clawing your way up the social ladder in Paris. Maybe in their fondest imaginations, all the way to the court of Versailles, where the King and Queen of France ruled." And this was a big deal for her new family because they were not much higher up on the social scale than her Martinique family was. They were desperately trying to work their way up the ranks of the French aristocracy. So Joséphine gets taken around Paris with her aunt. They spend what, in relation to a working person's income, was a small fortune on dressing her in the most expensive silks that were allowed, and laces and embroidery. Very importantly, all of these surface items had to be put over the equivalent of cages that upper class women were obliged to wear. Boned stays, they were called. In the 19th century, they would come to be called corsets. And layers and layers of enormous petticoats, pounds and pounds, so heavy, these petticoats, and sometimes augmented by these paniers, they were called, sort of basket things, sometimes made out of metal, that held out the surfaces of the skirts that women were obliged to wear. It was a sort of strange way, well, I guess strange to us, luckily, of controlling women. Working class women, of course, had to be able to move to work, but upper class women, who in some ways had more financial power, were trapped in these undergarments over which they displayed the signs of their rank. And that's what Joséphine had to do for her family.
That is quite a transition, quite a change for Joséphine. But of course, the individual thing that's happening to her, the change there, very much pales in comparison as we keep turning the pages of the book and get to, of course, the French Revolution. I wonder if we can talk for a moment. We'll get back to women's fashion, but if we can talk about men's fashion for a moment, because as you discuss in the book, the French Revolution did have concerns around fashion, but on changing men's fashion. So can you give us a brief overview, kind of what was changing about men's fashion? Why was this something the revolution was bothered with? And why it was only for what men wore, not women?
You've put it perfectly, Miranda. As the ordinary people of France, who were called the Third Estate, were allowed, because of a financial crisis, to send representatives to the royal court, they began to wonder what they would wear for this extraordinary assembly because of those sumptuary laws we were talking about. And the court etiquette enforcers wrote back to these representatives and said, well, you're going to wear your Third Estate type dark wool suits, and the first and second aristocratic estates are going to be attired in their magnificence, meaning what they were entitled to by sumptuary laws, the colors, the textures, the feathers. Whereupon the revolutionaries, who really had in mind a principled transformation of all of society, not just the surface, but all of society, shot back, no way. Everyone has to wear those black suits because we're all equal representatives of the French nation. So there was a big fight about it back and forth in May of 1789. And the Third Estate ordinary representatives won. Over the course of the summer, it became clear that everyone who represented the country had to wear the same kind of clothing to show that they were representing the nation as citizens. And why was it restricted to men? Okay, because even though the revolutionaries wanted to fundamentally change society, the one thing they didn't want to change was the gendered relationships between women and men. They felt that only men could be citizens of the nation because only men were born with the intellect and the independence of thought that would allow them to be citizens. They wanted women to remain subordinate to men. So they thought it was just fine that women would keep on wearing those stays and petticoats.
But there were some women who did not agree with that. Let's introduce the second of the three women that the book centers on. I hope I'm pronouncing her name vaguely correctly. Térézia?
Oh, yes, absolutely. She moved, she was Spanish and came to France, so there were a lot of different pronunciations.
Fair enough. Can you tell us a bit about her and how she came to be the center of what you call the perfect fashion storm that went from this French Revolution men's change of let's keep women still separate to really quite a dramatic shift that she and Joséphine are in the middle of?
Térézia was, like Joséphine, married at an insanely young age into a mainland French family in order to rise up the hierarchy. She was already, as a young girl, famous for her beauty. When she came to France, she quickly came to be thought of as the most beautiful woman in all of Europe. There was a remarkable consensus around that. Then the revolution explodes. It allows Térézia to divorce that first husband she had been forced to marry, but it began to threaten her safety because she had been married to an aristocrat, although a minor one. So she took up with one of the revolutionaries. Nonetheless, she got tossed into jail during the Terror. Realizing she was about to be guillotined, she got a message out to that revolutionary lover of hers and said, "This is it. Either you overthrow the Terror and Robespierre, or I'm going to die on the guillotine." This galvanized him, and he and his friends did overthrow Robespierre, and therefore Térézia emerged from prison credited by all of Europe with the overthrow of the Terror, which gave her a lot of social power. But the whole revolution had left her in a desperate state. She had no money, no husband, no property, no title. And so she had nothing left to lose. And meanwhile, she met Joséphine, who had also been tossed into prison during the Terror, who emerged also completely desperate. And the two of them together decided that because they had nothing left to lose, they would gamble everything on a spectacular fashion change. And all of that against the background of the collective trauma that the first two phases of the French Revolution, the constitutional phase and the Terror phase, had inflicted on the country. That's why it was a perfect storm.
So many pieces all coming together in these few women and the kind of different strands of what's happening politically, personally, etc. But there are a few other aspects I want to make sure we kind of bring into the fashion storm that they create. We spoke earlier about what sort of fashion and creativity Joséphine would have seen in Martinique and kind of what women there were doing that was so different from what she then saw in Paris. But there are some other influences that Joséphine and Térézia are drawing on in the creation of this radical new clothing. Can you tell us about some of these other things they're drawing from, and then kind of, what did they come up with?
Well, there was an ambient revival of antiquity among elite intellectuals. There had been some wearing of pseudo-Greek costumes before the Revolution. However, ancient Greek costume had been made with many, many bulky yards of wool fabric, loosely draped around the body. From the point of view of northern France, that, although it was sort of an interesting idea, was not going to be practical to wear every day because it was at once too bulky and not warm enough. But that straight white silhouette allowed Joséphine, I think particularly, to remember the straight white cotton silhouettes of the dresses that she had been raised with on Martinique. And meanwhile, Térézia was remembering the straight white cotton undergarment that she had been reduced to in prison. So these two women brilliantly realized that they could wear fitted white straight cotton dresses that even looked a lot like Indian menswear that Paris had been exposed to in the late 1880s. And it would pass for neoclassical, but in a much, much more fetching, fitted way that was really, really invented in the first months of the fall of 1794, right after Joséphine and Térézia emerged from jail.
I mean, fetching and fitted, that sounds nice now. And I can definitely tell listeners if they haven't looked at the book yet, again, these images make it very clear how much more freedom of movement there would be, for one thing, from these outfits. But what were initial reactions like at the time? I mean, was it kind of, oh my God, this is amazing, or not so much?
People were stunned and amazed. Absolutely. They were shocked. They were delighted. Some people said, it's neoclassicism. Some people said, it's like nothing we've seen before. Everyone was amazed that you could see women move. The idea of nakedness did start being circulated, but at first it was really just the shock of women being able to be seen to have lower limbs that just seemed to be like nothing anyone had witnessed before in fashion.
Could you maybe describe, obviously it's not as good as having an image necessarily, but could you maybe describe kind of an example of what this might look like, so that listeners can have an image in their mind as we continue discussing?
Imagine very fine white cotton imported from India, Indian muslin, made into a tiny fitted bodice that ends right under the bust, and then one long column of skirt. The whole thing worn over a slip, usually tinted blue, pink, peach. So at once opaque and diaphanous, completely light, completely mobile, allowing a freedom of movement that women had never had before. Okay, here's also a way of thinking about it. After the book came out, I came across a British fashion magazine, and I thought, well, let's see what happens in the fall of 1794. So I look at August of 1794, And I see white cotton gowns of the old Ancien Régime style clearly worn over these stays and petticoats. And then, by December of 1794, it's white cotton dresses, but over no restrictive foundation garments. That's the big, big difference. So it's all between August of 1794 and December of 1794. So fast.
So fast, really quite fast, even by today's standards. And of course, back then, even more radical for the speed and everything else. But these garments, I mean, the movement, it's amazing. But the whole idea, you've mentioned it a few times, of like never had this kind of freedom before. We just talked about how there were a whole bunch of people who are not excited about the idea of women having freedom or changing despite the revolution that was going on. So as much as it sounds like it was shock and amazement, it doesn't necessarily seem like, yay, let's everyone do it, or let's consider this acceptable, right? That feels to me like where you brought in the third of the three women, Juliette. You talk about her legitimizing this fashion revolution. So can you tell us a bit about who she is and how she was able to play this role?
Juliette Récamier had a very exceptional upbringing. She had one very beautiful mother and three fathers. They may not have quite been sure which of these men was her biological father. When the terror struck, they decided together, the four parents, that Juliette should marry the richest of the three fathers, who her mother was not technically married to. She had been sort of arbitrarily married to one of the men just to make the child legitimate. And part of the idea was that he looked like he was going to be guillotined during the terror. And they figured, well, she'd emerge the heiress of all the money. Well, he survived, and the father who she had married was almost certainly her biological father. So the family had to do a quick PR turnaround and whisper that the marriage had never been consummated. Of course, otherwise it would have been incestuous. So they were condemning Juliette to perpetual virginity. But she, rather than suffering this as a terrible fate, looked at the new dresses that had been introduced in the fall of 1794 and how they were made out of white cotton. And she realized that she could become an international style celebrity by embracing this in its all-white version as an advertisement for her virginity.
And so was it this link then with virginity rather than like radical freedom of movement that made her involvement in this trend legitimate?
Yes, it really helped. Joséphine and Térézia were famously very sexually free. They took lovers at will. Whereas Juliette was so increasingly famously virginal, that she gave just enough purity to the whole style to make it palatable for everybody. And then there was the idea of democracy, which Juliette became also increasingly a symbol of because her friends were very resolutely in favor of equal rights. This style, besides being obviously a rejection of monarchic style, was also infinitely less expensive than sumptuary law summits had been. The heights of fashion were suddenly affordable certainly by every woman in the middle class, and even by women at the top of the artisanal social scale. And so, for very real material reasons, this style looked like it was a style for democracy, which is why American women adored it. American women who were in Paris spread the word as fast as they could back to North America, saying, these Parisian revolutionaries have invented the style that is appropriate for our new United States.
It's very interesting to think about kind of the ways in which things can be taken up. And of course, we've now got to a point where we have kind of all three of the women together with this revolution. But it's not just the dresses. As much as the kind of white column of purity is such an interesting image, you also talk about in the book that accessories are a really big part of this as well. So can you tell us about what some of these accessories were and why? This is not incidental. This is a key part of what this revolution in dress is, right?
Absolutely, both on the level of style and on the level of function. On the level of style, the white column was a lovely absolute minimalist idea, but women longed for a little zing, a little bit of color, a little bit of fling. And so a whole range of accessories from head to toe got invented, the most important of which was the handbag. Okay, and here's where style met function. When you had a long, straight, white cotton dress, there wasn't much possibility of putting anything heavy in a pocket because it would ruin the line. People had pockets underneath those big, voluminous dresses for hundreds of years. But now the handbag was necessary to carry one's stuff. And this was one of a number of functional items which, besides filling stylistic needs, also just allowed women to function out in the public sphere. The shoes became flat and had laces. Fashion magazine said, okay, ladies, now you've got lace-up shoes, so go stride the boulevards of Paris. They had fitted jackets that kept them warm, bonnets that really protected them from the wind, and most importantly, shawls, which Joséphine had transferred from a Kashmiri northern Indian fashion orbit into her European fashion universe. These shawls were of a different proportion, much longer and thinner than European shawls, and were made with this fantastic, light, warm Kashmiri wool and beautiful, intricate embroidery at the ends. Joséphine popularized them, and soon everyone wanted to have one to wrap around the silhouette of the white cotton dress.
To be honest, it sounds pretty fun. And certainly more fun than the kind of world of corsets before it. And the accessories, the kind of walking around, the being able to carry things definitely has a practical element as well. So lots of benefits, at least that I can see, for women to take this up. And yet it disappears. It doesn't last. What happens to this revolution in women's dress?
Well, surprisingly enough, because sometimes history is very gradual, we have one event that marks the beginning of the end of this revolution. It's the coronation of Napoleon. Napoleon had originally been the less powerful partner in his marriage with Joséphine. Her fashion star status had gotten him his first big military break. But then, as we all know, Napoleon rose to supreme power and began to feel that personally and nationally, it was time for a return to order, a turning back of the freedom that his own wife and all French women had been enjoying. So he told his wife that for the coronation ceremony in December of 1804, she would not design her own outfit. His friend, a stylist, would design the costumes. And so Joséphine was obliged to wear an immensely heavy velvet train and a dress encrusted with embroidery, a big, stiff, rigid collar behind her. It's all beautifully captured in a painting by the French painter David. And that was the beginning of the end. It all got turned back.
I mean, that could have just been one moment, right? I mean, obviously it wasn't, but why was that the beginning of the end? What happened after that coronation ceremony? Why was that moment so impactful?
Well, just as Napoleon was trying to reverse some, though not all, aspects of the French Revolution, the monarchies of Europe were trying to turn back every aspect of the French Revolution. They wanted to reinstate monarchy in France and defend their royal prerogatives all over Europe. And just as clothing had been a symptom of revolution, so clothing became a symptom of a return to order.
And so it all got rolled back to corsets, back to velvet, back to sumptuary law.
It was, in a way, almost worse than ever for women, because those 18th century stays were stiffened with whalebone, which is actually somewhat pliable, although all the stitching, all the channels in the stays made the garments pretty rigid. But then in the 19th century, the corsets got stiffened with metal, and the skirts got even bigger because new technologies allowed for hoops. And so women were more encaged than they had ever been before, while men retained the democratic three-piece wool suit for themselves.
And still very much, I mean, that's what a lot of men still wear, is that three-piece suit.
Amazingly, yes, that aspect of the French Revolution is still with us.
Any other aspects of the French Revolution or the story you've told us that are still with us, or any longer term implications we should think about as we come to the end of our discussion?
Well, fashion goes in a kind of oscillating pattern between gigantic excess and minimalist purity. And gradually, through those oscillations, we arrived at the 1970s and 80s, which is really when women regained the freedoms that had been won in 1794. It took a long time, but I don't think there's any going back now.
Yeah, I think the moment for any going back has definitely passed with Napoleon. So that's perhaps a good thing. And I think probably a good place to end our discussion on this book, leaving me with just one final question. In the investigation for this, obviously you went through all sorts of cool archival material, as you mentioned right at the beginning. This was all, in fact, sparked by coming across something in the archive. So I guess my last question is, have you found the next thing you want to pursue? Are there spin-offs from this project you're intrigued by? What might you be working on next, whether or not it's a book that you'd like to give us a sneak preview of?
Well, I'm writing an introduction to the memoirs, the souvenirs of the painter Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, who claimed to have introduced those pseudo-ancient Greek costumes to fashion, having realized that she introduced only the surface of a revolution and not the deep underlying part of the revolution. I felt like I understood her art better, in for better and for worse. So I'm doing an introduction to a new edition of Vigée Lebrun's Souvenirs, and I will say, maybe she had a superficial idea of fashion, but she was the first woman artist who had a spectacularly successful career, earned huge amounts of money, in demand all over Europe. It was pretty fabulous.
That does sound pretty fabulous. And of course, fabulous is also a great word to describe the book we've been discussing. So for any listeners who want to go get all the details we weren't able to cover here, the book is titled Liberty, Equality, Fashion, The Women Who Styled the French Revolution, published in 2024 by Norton. And thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and telling us about your book.
Miranda, thank you so much for our conversation.